afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 26th Asia Pacific Regional Social Work Conference 2021. My name is Robin Hoffman, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for this session on refugees. We have 4 abstract presentations joining us today who'll speak one after the other. There'll be 20 minutes of Q&A at the end of all presentations, and I'll encourage you to place your questions in the live Q&A button, not the Zoom chat button, as we go along, so that you don't forget your questions. Please note in your questions which presenter your question will be for, and I'll then present these questions at the end. So it is great delight that I introduce David Keegan, whose presentation is entitled Distributive Protection. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Okay, so as was said, I'm going to talk about distributive protection, and this is really an outline of what we see as a social work practice in approaching international protection and particularly working with refugees. As it is a short presentation, I'll keep it brief. So just a little bit about HOST. We're an Asia Pacific NGO that established in 2016, and we deliberately set up to try and create co-designed innovative solutions to refugee protection, both for and with displaced people, to drive long-lasting change, systemic change and measurable impact. And we do this in partnership with host communities. We have about 63 staff, 120 volunteers, and we work very much with local partnerships. We also try to use the SDG framework, and these are the main SDGs that we try to address in our work across the region. We operate in Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand. So what I want to talk to you today is about some social work principles that I think are really important in this space and that guide our practice. And not going into these in detail because of the time, but essentially we try to focus on anti-colonial, anti-oppressive practice. I know these two things are somewhat different, but we see them as both addressing power structures, being mindful of privilege, and addressing structural inequalities. Systems theory is obviously a core social work approach. I would summarize this as understanding individuals as part of complex social systems. So we need to deal with the individual and the social. And distributive justice, I guess, is a concept that, put simply, understands a mutual duty between societies and individuals in need. I guess, and I'll come back to how these work in practice in relation to the proposition. So the international refugee protection, I thought I'd just set some context, and sorry if some of you understand this already, but many people don't realize that about 1% of the world's population is forcibly displaced. That's over 80 million people, and that includes internally displaced and people that have fled the country to become a refugee. Much of the emphasis in international protection is focused around international institutions such as UNHCR, IOM, and INGOs. And by this, I mean that the experience that refugees tell us is that they flee their country, they find a place of asylum, and then they become subject to this system where they have no control and where they're waiting for resettlement or waiting for durable solutions. So UNHCR refers to 3 durable solutions that are resettlement to a third country, integration in the country or in another country that they flee to, or return to the country of origin. But for many refugees, these options don't happen. And so many people remain stuck in countries of asylum for many, many years. And often the services that are there for them in the humanitarian space are actually very crisis-driven, focused on handouts associated with crisis responses, or they're structured around resettlement or return, which only a very few percentage of people actually access. There is this concept of complementary protection, which is other strategies that can be used to provide essentially temporary protection. This includes work visas or temporary visas, but I won't go into that here. It's also worth noting that about 80% of refugees live in developing countries, and there's increasing use of externalization practices by the wealthier countries who typically resettle to try and pass, putting it plainly, to pass responsibility to other countries to manage refugee flows. So the problem we see with protection is that it often equates to a sense of rescue and is often situated within colonial frameworks. and institutions. So it's the idea of the wealthy coming in to protect. But I think what I want to propose is that refugees become powerless in that system, and that what we need to do is to be able to think about how we can reinstitute power back to the people that are affected by that, and that this is a social work principle. Lack of agency for refugees refugees have a lack of agency and a means to independently access protection because they're subject to these systems, which ultimately creates dependency rather than agency. So I'm not necessarily proposing that those systems are not needed, but I'm suggesting that there's an imbalance towards the systems and the structures, and not enough focus on empowering the individual. And this quote here from a refugee who is displaced, I think sums this up well. It says, in most cases, we refugees are just the consumers of what has been decided by the local and international NGOs and other stakeholders. But to only give us the opportunity to narrate our stories without giving us the opportunity to participate in finding solutions together cannot help us. Instead, such will add to our sorrow. We would like this narrative to change. So the solution, I think social workers need to be brokers for the redistribution of power. And by this, I mean that the goal of protection should be to build up a protection toolbox for individuals that would enable them to self-protect or have more agency in seeking a protection solution. So we're really interested in how social work, and as social work as a profession, can be advocates for giving power to refugee-led solutions, giving power to local host community-led solutions, rather than it always being the INGOs or the donors or the UN institutions coming in and trying to solve the problem. And I am oversimplifying, but I think it's worth drawing more attention to this issue. There needs to also be more alignment with needs in hosting communities. One of the biggest challenges in working with refugees in displacement locations is the conflict that happens between local communities and refugees, because there's a sense that refugees are getting something special compared to the host communities, or vice versa. So we found that the best systems work where you have an alignment between the needs of the host community and the displaced. And this requires capacity building for local institutions and challenging structural barriers. So this quote again from a similar group of refugees was, we would like to see all stakeholders and humanitarian actors giving us rooms to actively contribute towards solutions of own problems together with their full support, and look at us not as a threat, but as partners in designing solutions to refugee crises. So we propose that there's this idea of distributive protection built on the idea of distributive justice, and taking into those concepts of social work practice that I briefly mentioned before. We believe that there needs to be a shift away from programs primarily focused on delivering short-term aid or skills training alone, towards programs that build agency, choice, and build a refugees protection toolbox to facilitate better access to available protection pathways. So we have four key components that we summarize this in. Essentially, individuals will increase their protection if they build networks. This is networks to local services, information, people, and resources. Build their knowledge, so they need to be aware of their rights, they need to be aware of opportunities, they need to be aware of how to navigate informal knowledge pathways in the local system, and their responsibilities under the law. Agency refers to the individual confidence and capacity to make decisions about a protection pathway that is best for them. So this is about giving people the sense that they have choice and agency in their context. And this is very difficult for many refugees who have very limited legal protection rights in many places of asylum. And bridge building is an important aspect too, which is essentially tied up in concepts of social cohesion. The idea that you need to help people to build bridges between different parts of community, but also overcome barriers associated with trauma and discrimination. So I'm aware that my time is basically up, but I just thought I'd give you a quick practical example from our work in Thailand. So in Thailand, we run a program that's a pilot program to release families with children that have been detained in immigration detention in Bangkok, and they are released into the community. Essentially, they're arrested within a community. In Thailand, they have no legal right to work. They're considered illegal immigrants. They have no access to income other than emergency aid from UN-funded programs. They get detained. They can then get released on a bail program to the casework program that we're providing. And essentially what we do is try to provide them with support to re-enter into that unstable situation where they have no legal rights, but to try and build their protection capacity in that process. And I guess what we're doing is trying to connect them to local people, local Thai people in that community. We're working with Thai community to identify needs in common. So one of those needs in common was food security issues. So we've taken a fairly obvious approach to that in working on a community garden where the refugee members and the host community work together around creating a garden where they can get access to fresh food. And through that process, they're building relationships. But what's been really interesting about that is they've built access to information networks that help them to avoid getting arrested again. They help them to get ideas about accessing income, and they're able to build a social support network. And so I guess in a practical way, we've tried to bring people together, build their networks, help them to learn, but at the same time, help them to understand what their rights are and how to access support when they need it. But they're still in an insecure protection state, but the participants respond to us by saying that they feel like they're more in control of their situation and more able to self-protect, if you like, in that context. So I might leave it at that and happy to take questions at the time.
Thank you so much, David. We might have a little bit more time at the end to hear more about that case study. I'd really like to. I'd now like to introduce Dorothy Herscher and Charlene Niparas, who are presenting on reconsidering human rights in the context of mass displacement and encampment of refugees.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Indeed, I would like to welcome you also on behalf of my co-presenter, Charlene Niparas from RMIT University, as we are having a conversation about how we might go about reconsidering social work's commitment to human rights in the face of mass displacement and specifically the encampment of refugees. Now, how do I move the slide? My apologies for that, the slide is not moving. I will have to do it like this. My apologies for that.
Thanks, Dorothy. I'd just like to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we present this paper. We respectfully acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. We would also like to acknowledge any elders, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and any other First Nations people who are with us today.
All right, thank you, Charlene. This really is a paper that represents a conversation rather than completed thoughts. And this conversation between Charlene and I started with a shared sense that something is ajar between social work's historical and seemingly unwavering commitment to human rights and its evolving global context in which social workers practice. We note, firstly, that there is a growing displacement of humans, particularly forced displacement, over the past decade, and we expect that over the decades to come, this trend is going to strengthen. We note further that it is the descendants often of colonized people who make up the bulk of the displaced, whereas it is the former colonial and current neo-colonial powers which remain important destination points, even if they're only aspirational and not actually ever reached by many. We finally note the growing incidence worldwide of encampment of humans, including at the internal and external borders of former colonial and neo-colonial states. So much so that Achille Mbembe considers encampment to be a new form of global governance.
So the key question for us is, what are the implications of the jarring between social work's self-understanding as a human rights profession on the one hand, and an evolving geopolitical context which highlights, recreates and exacerbates conceptual, ethical and practice-based limitations and internal contradictions of this self-understanding on the other.
In doing so, and in reflecting on social work's unwavering commitment to human rights, we decided to consider three interrelated debates that are encapsulated in the terms of colonialism, coloniality, necropolitics, and critical posthumanism. The decolonial argument really is around the question, in a nutshell, whether there continues to be humans that are worth or often treated as less than human. According to decolonial scholars, the term decoloniality is important here as it denotes the structures of power established during colonial conquest, subjugation, and rule, which, however, continue to operate in the relations between countries of the global North and South to date. We contend that contemporary migratory routes and the treatment of displaced persons at the borders of former colonial and neo-colonial powers reflect this notion of coloniality, suggesting that overall descendants of colonized people continue to be considered humans of lesser moral worth. The necropolitical argument is related to this, and it considers the question of the governance of life and death. The term necropolitics was coined by Achille Mbembe in 2003. It denotes that sovereign states do not just have the power to govern the living, but to govern also death and dying, including the question of who may live and who must die. Mbembe contends that colonialism and the racist ideologies on which it was based are classic examples of necropolitics. We want to suggest that the mass displacement of refugee encampment are a continuation of colonial traditions of the subjugation, expropriation, and displacement of brown people. The critical post-human argument is a little bit more complex for our purposes here. We want to draw on it as this is one of the traditions that have raised the ontological question of whether human beings are better understood as discrete sovereign individuals or as relational beings. These concerns have also been raised in other traditions, for example, by care ethicists and many indigenous scholars. We chose to draw on critical posthumanism here because it draws our attention to the fact that as social workers, we will always be entangled with the injustices to which we want to respond and cannot claim innocence in relation to them. We also want to draw attention to the fact with posthumanism that when claiming responsibility towards particular injustices, we must always also consider our ability to respond to them. Raidotti suggests that we adopt a post-identitarian mode of thinking, that is, we treat being as a matter of singularities without identity, as a way of relating intimately to one another and the environment within which we are located. This, we think, might be a useful way of reconsidering how to understand and respond to the massification of human suffering, such as that which we're witnessing and are called to respond to in the global context of mass displacement and encampment. The notion of human rights, attributed as they are to individuals and groups, might not suffice as an analytic lens, the moral compass, and the practice tools that we as social workers may need at this point in time.
So the question for us is, where to from here for social work? So human rights are complex and they're contested. Many critiques have been mounted against human rights, both within and outside social work. And yet social work's commitment to human rights is often taken for granted, discussed uncritically and expressed rhetorically. And we think that this is neither sustainable nor defensible. The three critiques that Dorothy outlined raise pertinent questions for social work generally, and social work in relation to people who are displaced, who are seeking asylum, and who are increasingly encamped in particular. And for someone who is committed to the idea of human rights, these critiques leave me with some disquiet. Nevertheless, it's not our contention today to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And so therefore our tentative conclusions about the jarring that we have described are: human rights continue to be relevant. They continue to serve an important purpose in social work's mission. However, social work's inability to respond to growing global, historical and structural injustices in terms of its normative commitments is bound to increase. Therefore, conceptual questions arise around the full extent to which human rights can define social work. That is, its self-understanding as a human rights-based profession must be carefully historicised and contextualised. And also, practice and ethical implications arise around the limits of what a human rights-based profession can hope to achieve.
On to the recommendations then. Again, in some ways, they are really tentative, and we're hoping that this will be an opening of a debate rather than a closing of a debate. But Charlene's, in my view, at this point is this. There is really a need to temper our self-understanding and normative claims as a profession with an appreciation of the insights generated through the theoretical discourses and debates outside of social work about contemporary humans' entanglement in historical injustices. And with that, the entanglement of social work and social workers in historical injustices. We also think that we need to temper our self-understanding and normative claims with some self-criticality and humility around what social work can realistically expect to achieve in the face of historical and contemporary systemic violations of human and other beings, all at the same time as not abandoning our commitment to defending and promoting human rights where they are violated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well done, Charlene and Dorothy. Finished with 50 seconds to go. You might get some time afterwards to say a little bit more, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'd now like to hand over to Zoe Wyatt, whose presentation is Building Inclusive Societies, What We Can Learn from Cambodian Trauma Survivors. Thanks, Zoe.
Hi. All right, I've got my screen up, lovely. So hello everyone, and I'm really excited to talk to you today. And even though I present for a living, the context of this, I'm super nervous. So let's dig in. First of all, I would like to talk about my research. I've recently finished my PhD, and my time in Cambodia and what I have learned there from trauma survivors I've worked with has been, I think, very applicable to some of the earlier conversations we've been having in regards to displaced, as much as, sorry, I should flag immediately, these Cambodians are in Cambodia, therefore not refugees. However, marginalisation, histories of trauma, there are some crossovers here. And I'm going to focus in on that. But in my first year of social work studies at Deakin University, they taught us a fabulous expression, locate yourself in the picture. And it's something that I have always done ever since. So I'm originally from Melbourne, and I have had quite a, I would say, remarkable research journey myself. I was part of a Cambodian study tour as part of my social work studies, and I went to Cambodia and I heard from an organisation, Hagar International, and to use an expression that they use in Cambodia, it touched my heart. I loved the work that they did. I became very interested, and as part of my honours, I did a small piece of research on their trauma-informed program in their school. It was through this time I spoke to clinicians, social workers, and teachers that are Khmer, and they started to talk to me about some of their older students that had grown up and had been, well, they'd set up their own families and had access to education and had carved out quite a remarkable life, because Hagar works with survivors of child trafficking and modern day slavery. So at that time, I had this real interest in trauma. And my final work placement, I went to Thailand and I started working in an inpatient treatment setting because I wanted to learn in a practical sense about trauma. And that also snowballed, and I am still affiliated with this group. I went on to be a primary therapist in Thailand and whilst doing my PhD research. So what started with a little interest in trauma has turned into a career and also my academic underpinning. So when I say I recently finished a PhD, that was 2 weeks ago. I got my Deakin email, so I'm pretty excited. But what happened at the end of last year is I was looking for a forever home. I was coming to the end of my research. Melbourne is too cold for me, so I decided on Mauritius, where I'm joining you from today, a little island off the coast of Africa. So now, more importantly, what was this research all about and how does it relate to refugee communities? As I mentioned, Hagar has been at the centre of my research and also some of my work. I've been linked with Hagar in Myanmar, and I wanted a balance, so it wasn't just one NGO's snapshot. And This Life Cambodia works with young people who have children who have been in jail. And Flame is centred around education in the slums and in the communities of Cambodia. They essentially sponsor children to have access to education. So they all have different areas, but the one area that links them together is in terms of trauma. All of their beneficiaries or clients, depending on what term you use, have had extensive trauma. And what I was really curious about was the recovery process for these young people. What helped, what worked for them. And I should just once again locate myself in the picture. My work in Thailand was in trauma, but access to this, well, to be perfectly frank, it was an expensive treatment setting. So I had a lot of clients coming from first world countries such as Australia and Europe, and they had access to what they do not have in Cambodia: medical, healthcare, and additional supports for trauma, addiction, eating disorders, and those kinds of areas. So given the extensive trauma that a lot of these clients and beneficiaries in Cambodia have experienced, I was very interested in the how of recovery. And there has been so much written around resilience, and I'm going to share, my academic supervisor in the area of health at Deakin said to me when I first embarked on this, she said, "I'm not very keen on the term resilience." And I said, "If my PhD is on that, is that going to be a problem for you?" And her term was, "I want you to blow up resilience," and how it's not applicable in a Cambodian context, because she has done over 30 years of research in Cambodia, and that's why she was my academic supervisor. But it raised some really interesting questions, because when you look at social work research, there is a huge volume that does say the use of labels in terms of resilience is not applicable to developing nations and outside of a Western construct of resilience. And so that was my lens sort of looking at this. And other key areas in terms of the diversity was Hagar and Flame's focus on education meant that many of their survivors had access to university. And This Life Cambodia upskilled young people in jails, and many of them didn't have more than a primary school education. So we're looking at very different outcomes in terms of these groups. Also, it is a Buddhist nation, Cambodia, but Hagar and Flame both have Christian underpinnings. So that was interesting to see how faith spirituality, and also the Cambodian history in terms of animism and the spirit world were presenting as a resilience factor for many of these young people. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about their stories and what I had captured in the data, starting with the sort of what happened. So a couple of similarities with everyone in these various groups, these young people. And I should just point out young is 18 to 30. That many, except for one, had backgrounds of life in the rural provinces. And statistically, that's what has occurred in Cambodia, a mass migration to the cities in order to work. But life in the rural provinces is, there is systemic poverty. For those of you who are familiar with the background of Cambodia, the genocide has led to incredible levels of violence. It has one of the highest levels of gang rape and gender-based violence in the Southeast Asia region, or it has the highest in Southeast Asia. And so we're looking at systemic community issues, and a lot of these children have grown up in this, where violence has been normalised in a lot of ways. A lot of them spoke of being in fear and also not trusting anyone. Interestingly, they all had one significant adult in their early life, but trust comes up later in their lives in terms of stigma. And this is also a crossover with refugees communities, not feeling like they belong. Certainly for some of the women that I spoke to, there is still quite a bit of victim blaming that occurs in communities around sexual assault. And they spoke of feeling, because everyone would find out, they're less than, marginalised, rejected by their communities, and the lack of trust that they have, and particularly for all men, was really significant. And where resilience literature tends to go to in terms of the bouncing back model is not something that I personally subscribe to. I feel that some of the stories that talked about, the pain, the rejection, the trauma, and the ongoing stigmatization that was captured means that some of the participants struggled with anger management issues, substance abuse issues, and does that make them less resilient? Because in terms of the stories that were captured, it was the journey. It was this moving forward, as the Cambodians say, step by step. And that was the part that I was really interested in. Oops, hang on. Where was I? Nope, what did they do? That's where I wanted. Sorry, I'm losing my slides. So that was the one I was supposed to be on. That's what I need now, right? So what did I learn? What can we take from this? Social connectedness was key. And for my social workers in the group, I know that's not a surprise right there, but it was around connecting with other survivors. It was about normalising their experiences and not feeling so alone in the world. Many of them were orphans that I had met, and the stigma against orphans in Cambodia is very high. And what that is based around is, if your parents guide you in life and create morals and values, and Buddhist morals and values, if you don't have parents, then you lack that moral foundation. And a lot of the participants, the orphans, talked about this. Many orphans are street kids in Cambodia, and so people believe that if you're an orphan, you can be bad. And that was the perception. And this followed the young people throughout the course of their life. One participant told me about how He had established himself. He'd worked really hard in university, and he owned a Lexus. He thought that was very important to him, but it was around, I'm successful now. He had 2 degrees and a good job, and he was engaged to be married, and the pastor of his church said to his wife's or future wife's parents, you can't let your daughter marry him. He's just an orphan guy. And tears welled up in his eyes. A lot of the participants that talked about that community stigma had this really profound sense of rejection again and again and again. So when they were linked in with other survivors, that's how they started to feel empowered and to find their voices. And what I found just so moving was how many of these young people were working at the front line of trauma. There was a psychologist, a doctor in the slums who was studying surgery. There was a lot of them working in different boarding facilities for women, unwed mothers, meaning a lot of women who had experienced sexual abuse, much like their stories. So they were almost creating meaning out of the work that they were doing. And as one participant said to me, if it wasn't for all of the bad stuff that happened to me, I wouldn't be where I am today. And so through helping others, there was this cyclical process of healing that occurred. So they still had their struggles, and the notion of bouncing back might not be applicable in terms of the theory around resilience and what that looks like. But I would argue that these young people are incredibly resilient. I have a clicker so I can move through these slides in a lovely way. So just finally, building inclusive societies. What we can take from this is when there is empowerment, survivor-led models, and essentially bringing the young people into future programming is where it's at. What I did see with this process of recovery and connection, belonging, has all been established through survivor-led models. This is what I've found in my experience with these young people to be really effective. And that was the short snapshot. So if you would like to connect with me further and check out my article on ResearchGate for more details, I would love to talk to you all. It's really exciting to be here, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Zoe. I think we could listen to that for a few more hours. Sadly, our 4th presenter, Hamad Olari, hasn't been able to join us today. So we have we're going to move straight to questions. We have a couple of questions in our chat box. So firstly, the first question is to you, David. What do social workers need to gain the understanding and cooperation of local residents who accept refugees?
Thanks for the question. Look, I don't think there's anything special about it. It's a fairly basic social work skill to engage with communities. What I'm advocating for, though, is that I think it's easy for us as social workers to talk about being client-led and thinking about how we work with communities. But I think it's very easy for us to get stuck into the assumptions of the institutions that we work for, and to get caught into what I would call expert syndrome, which is this idea of thinking that we know what everyone needs. And so at a basic level, I'm suggesting that we need to keep ourselves in check by regularly going to community. And what I mean by community, I guess, is in the context of refugees, is working with constituents that you're working with, but also working with the people that are connected to them in that society. So if you're taking a social systems view, we need to engage with the host communities. And at a basic level, I'm just suggesting that we should be asking people, what are your needs and how are you reacting in this situation? So I probably didn't get enough time to talk about how we did this in the case study, but essentially we were finding that we were resettling people back into parts of Bangkok where there were Thai people with who are experiencing poverty and needs. And so we started talking to them about what some of the day-to-day struggles they were experiencing, and realized they were very similar to the needs of the refugee people we're working with. And really just started asking them, would you like to work together with these people who are living in your community? They didn't know much about them. Through the process, they've learned some more, and they've actually come to realize that they have common needs and have become a support network for each other. So these are principles of human-centered design or co-design, and I just think that social workers we have some inbuilt skills and training to do this stuff well, and we should be helping to demonstrate this and keep ourselves true to that within the humanitarian space. So hopefully that addresses your question.
Thanks, David. Now we've got a good 20 minutes for questions, so please, if you want to put your questions in the Q&A chat box for our presenters, we've got a bit more time because we haven't had our last presenter. Okay, Zoe, this one's for you from Achiro. What should social workers do to help refugees who have closed their hearts in a harsh environment feel at ease and become familiar with the host country?
Such a great question. It doesn't lend itself to a simple explanation either. One of the tools that I used in my collection and methodology, which I feel has been I know it's been used in the literature with refugee groups, is a timeline of their strengths. So by looking at their life over, doing essentially a little, sorry, let me start the sentence again. So I use this in terms of collection for my methodology, and I asked a participant about their life, moving away from what happened in terms of their trauma. That was never the focus. It was what happened after. And we start to look at social connection and faith-based communities, and some of them would draw pictures, some of them would write dates, and just this little tool that can be shared with an individual can be really helpful because it's very strengths-based model. I would be looking very much at who's around that person and who they can connect to. Connection is key. Without that, I imagine that a refugee will continue to feel disjointed and lost in their host country. So coming back to where are their strengths and connecting them to whoever is around them, whether that's their immediate family or others in their community, would be key. That's the short answer. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Zoe, and stay there because we have a few more questions for you. This is from Candace. So I loved your presentation and the notion that resilience is not a term that can be truly applied to a developing country like Cambodia. For a trauma perspective, the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey is something used in Western society to help understand the likelihood of future outcomes for individuals. What are your thoughts on how the term resilience is used in developed countries, where they often have various support systems in place compared to developing countries?
It's really true, and I don't know if I did what my academic supervisor wanted to and blew up resilience, but I certainly tried to challenge that notion. My terminology for it is dynamism. That's another presentation though. So I like to look at these kind of moving pieces in someone's world and what they have access to, because the vast majority of Western models look at this individualistic construct, of self-efficacy and those areas, whereas what is very prevalent in a lot of developing nations is faith. And Western models of resilience, and particularly the dominant discourse of the medical model, doesn't account for that as a factor when we look at many countries in Asia and also in Africa. We see faith is almost front row center in how people connect to their community, how people have a sense of belonging. So it's not just, it's not in terms of what you believe, it's around how you practice that in your day-to-day life. So I'm not saying that one can't inform the other, and certainly you are correct. The ACE survey is used in a variety of settings, including developing nations, but I think that we have a lot to learn from other countries with different perspectives of resilience. And I'll just finish on this. The term resilience doesn't translate into Khmer. In Cambodia, resilience means pressure on rubber, so it's not a thing. They use words such as inner spine, backbone, and the ability to withstand those kinds of, which is not resilience. Resilience is, of course, bending in the breeze. So when people used to say, what are you researching in Cambodia? I'd say something that doesn't exist. It's a great question. I hope that answered it. Thank you.
It makes it very hard to research something that doesn't exist, Zoe.
I didn't use the word resilience with any of my participants, and not at any, because I didn't want to have a discussion as to the meanings, even though if you ask a Cambodian social worker, what does resilience mean? They're like, the ability to recover from adversity, and they've had the Western training, but the actual translation, it's not in the language. So I avoided that when I was talking to my participants, and instead adopted more of a strengths-based approach.
Great. Okay, a few more questions. Again for you, Zoe. From Ting Ting, to support the Cambodian young participants in your study, do you think we can take action on community level or advocacy level and interact with broader Cambodian community, make influence on stigma and stereotype of young offenders?
All of my recommendations were around that. And there's a lot of great work being done in communities that are community-led. There's women's groups that are emerging in Cambodia, and I would like and hope that this will change, but it's going to take a considerable amount of time. Also because of the challenges with law enforcement. You know, I spoke to women who had 12 years of waiting for repercussions towards their perpetrator, and they said they can't even go home because they get blamed for what happened to them when they were 10, and this perpetrator is still walking around their community. So it needs to be this collaborative approach between government, law enforcement, child protection, community elders, and that takes time. So I feel that we're edging closer, and as I said, there's some fantastic work being done. You know, Friends International is an organisation that works with street kids and also mothers in communities, and they are at the forefront of stopping orphanages. This is another area of systemic poverty. Orphanages are all over Cambodia. There's orphanage tourism. So there's a lot of problems that are resulting from community level poverty and misunderstanding and violence. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Zoe. David, this one's for you. From Ahmad, thank you for sharing your presentation. It would be nice to understand the challenges you have faced in the long-term settlement process for refugees in Thailand.
It's a good question. Look, to be clear, I guess we are not really working on securing long-term outcomes, and probably what I'm presenting is a fairly pragmatic approach to supporting people who are in displacement and in situations where there might be humanitarian responses. One of the practical things that is a challenge that does come up is that people in engaging with humanitarian actors like us are obviously concerned about their future resettlement options. But I think one of the challenges that exist in any refugee displacement context is that, you know, just the sheer numbers of resettlement places equal about 0.5% of the world's registered refugees. So that's the 26 million that are registered with UNHCR. So many people won't see resettlement. And so part of what we're doing is helping people to come to terms with that reality and to think about ways that they can engage in the local community that will help them to improve a level of quality of life, rather than being stuck in this persistent state of trauma and disadvantage. And not that we can eliminate that completely, but I think that what social work has is the capacity to work at both those psychological levels and that community level to try and improve well-being. But yet I think what I'm commenting on is that I think our international protection systems don't do enough to address those issues and tend to focus more on the crisis side of things. And I think some of what Zoe's talking about is quite relevant to that in the way that we conceptualize and see people in disadvantage and how they cope in disadvantage. And part of that's about reframing the way we think about it and coming to communities to look at how we define that and how we define what's important. So, you know, in some ways, it's always going to be a problem that long-term protection is what people want. And there's, you know, it's not something we can fix, but it's something that we can help people deal with in the short term, I think.
Great, thank you, David. We have a question from Rosalie for Charlene and Dorothy. Thank you both for your paper providing a critical analysis of the ongoing relationship of social work practice with human rights. Can you talk more about the challenges for social workers who are working within a human rights framework and the necessity of rethinking this to better capture the realities of what is possible? Do we need a new discourse about practice and human rights without compromising the fundamental commitments?
Charlene, do you want to take it first?
I was just making sure that I'm unmuted. Thanks, Rosalie. Thanks for your question. And I think that this is the heart of the conversation that we've been having, Dorothy and I. And I suppose it's about thinking about how social work can really look at the notion of human rights in a more critical way to really look at the critiques that have been posed over many years, and to have a dialogue with the concept and reconstruct it so that it's not so binary in the way that we look at things. And I think that's what happens. We make these commitments. The commitments are taken for granted. We recite our commitments to social work, but we don't really we don't engage in a deeper conversation about what does that actually mean to be committed to human rights, and how do we put it in practice. And of course, the question for Dorothy and I has been, well, how do we do social work? How do we practice human rights in the situation of encampment? And so we first started looking at in depth in 3 case studies of situations of encampment around the world. We looked at Libya, Australia, and in Greece, and this is where we were having these conversations, and how that's where it started. Dorothy, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think part of our conversation is also not necessarily a practical one, but one of self-understandings as well. So I think the practical question is, you know, how do we respond to in situation where actually we cannot respond as we would like to, where the numbers are too high, the resources are too limited, and the context is actually dehumanizing. So I think there is that practical question, but I think there is that question about self-understandings. You know, how can we going forward really see ourselves if we say we were defined by this commitment, and yet we cannot enact that commitment. So I think, and that's where we brought in these issues of humility and self-criticality. And I do think some of these concepts that the post-humanists offer us, such as entanglement, to say, you know, and I think that would be interesting to get our co-presenters' view on that as well. So on the one hand, we go out wanting to do the right thing. On the other hand, we are actually implicated in systems that are intrinsically wrong. So the whole idea of entanglement, that we cannot escape the injustices that surround us, doesn't feature very highly in our current self-understanding. Likewise, this idea of responsibility, I think as social workers, we're very quick to say we are responsible for this, we want to take responsibility for that. But what do we do with the fact that entailed in the term responsibility is responsibility? So how do we integrate that in our understanding who we are?
I hope that answers your question, Rosalie.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got 4 minutes to go. So I'm just going to open this up to whoever thinks they've got a good answer. It's from Omar. How do you see refugees as contributors to the host community will increase their likability and as a platform to acquire skills and their desired agency? Anybody want to jump in on that one? David?
I'll have a go.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, look, I think this is an important question, I guess. But I mean, the unfortunate thing is that refugees are politicized, we know, everywhere. And so their real contribution to society is rarely recognized by governments. But there's been plenty of research that articulates the economic and the social benefits that integrating migrants of all types, including refugees, has on a society. But I guess we need to be pragmatic about the reality that migration is politicized, that many politicians use it as a source of election manipulation. And I guess what we need to be doing, I guess, is helping to get the voices of communities to the forefront, that, and to identify, I think, with host communities in particular, those benefits, and for them to see the benefits at a grassroots level, because that will drive political action in relation to this issue. But I also don't pretend that that's going to change overnight. But certainly what we found is that where refugees and local communities work together around common needs, there's much more acceptance, and you get less of the local community making the complaints about the illegal migrants that are taking their jobs. And so, yeah, I think some of those benefits are obvious. I think the other thing that we're increasingly challenged to do is to spend time actually on programs that educate local communities about refugees and what they are and why they're there, and to move away from the idea that refugees are criminals or potential terrorists, or those sorts of language that our politicians in various countries have been leading the narrative on.
I think I would like to add to David on that issue in particular. I think when we speak about, educating communities, educating public opinion, I think I completely agree. This is hugely important. But at the same time, I think this is where we want to also be mindful of governance issues. That in a way, and this is where the encampment is sort of the canary in the coal mine, that so long as we actually have political systems that exclude, we can talk to communities, but we've got a very important adversary or important adversaries in that debate. So I think it is quite important there also to consider social work's political traditions, and to look at really good old advocacy, having a political voice, being part of larger conversations, as well as doing the hard work on the ground with refugees themselves and host communities as well.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of questions that we just didn't get time for, and I'm so sorry for that. I would just like to say a couple of people have been asking for Zoe's work. I did quickly put it in the chat box, but if you didn't see that, you will, the presentations are going to be up on the website for a while afterwards. So I just want to really say thank you very much for David, Dorothy, Charlene and Zoe. I think we could have talked about this for hours, but sadly we haven't had the time, but I'm glad that we did get a bit of extra time to answer all those fabulous questions that came through, and I apologise for those couple that we didn't get to. So thank you everybody. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your conference, and thank you again to our presenters.